Hey everyone, I'm Joe. Today it's time for me to do a book review of The Fifth Elephant, written by Terry Pratchett. This is a fantasy novel first published in 1999. It is the 24th Discord novel and the 5th novel set within the City Watch character subseries. So first of all, what is the Discord itself? Now, it is pretty much what it sounds like, at least on the surface. It is a disc-shaped world, a flat world, which logically or illogically rests on the back of 4 very large elephants, which in turn stand on the back of a very large world turtle called Greater Chewing, which swims through space as though it was water. Now this sounds strange because it is strange, but the absurdity and the illogical nature of a world like this existing creates all the characters, the magic, everything to do with this world of what it is because of how bizarre and strange this world is, and frankly it creates a lot of the humour, of which Pratchett is very well known for and is very much in this novel. So the book starts off in the city of Ankh-Morpork, which is essentially London, England, all its stereotypes and tropes twisted and turned and given a fantasy spin on them. You can tell that Pratchett has had great fun thinking up, how would a sort of a fantasy and a ridiculous version of London work to greater effect, and frankly he's enjoyed himself immensely, and the city is given a real personality of its own and becomes essentially the primary sort of character from the start of the book, really. However, the book starts off with a small crime being committed, namely the theft from the Dwarf Bread Museum of the Scone of Stone. This is a replica of the real thing, which is held in Otherworld, and it marks the celebration of the crowning of the Low King. The Low King is essentially a very old traditional role held by a particular dwarf at all times, and it's a very critical role because it essentially sort of determines what is dwarf culture and the sort of rules and regulations, as it were, of dwarf culture. And it just so happens that the biggest city with the largest dwarf population outside of Otherworld happens to be Ankh-Morpork. So this is a fairly major issue actually. It starts off very minor, but you realise that something more going on. And at the same time, the patrician of the city, Veterinary, who's a Machiavellian figure, brilliant character and really well described, decides that what needs to happen, because there is some tension in the city and obviously certain trade deals need to be renewed in Otherworld, is a trade envoy basically, and he decides that Vimes, Samuel Vimes, captain of the City Watch, needs to go to Otherworld and basically talk to the dwarf and the vampires and the werewolves and maybe the trolls, and basically sort out some diplomatic relations and trade deals. Now, Vimes is a bit suspicious of this because he's not known for his exactly diplomacy, well, not traditional diplomacy. He tends to just basically get angry with people and they aren't used to it, so they tend to sort of back down. And anyway, so he does go there because he basically sort of manipulated into going. He goes there in the company of his wife, Sybil Lumpkin, who is a very well bred woman. Her ancestry goes back years. She's stupidly rich as well, which means he happens to have access to large amounts of money, although that's irrelevant to the plot. He also goes there with Sherry, the dwarf, who is an openly female dwarf, which is a big thing within the species of being a dwarf. Normally all dwarves look very much the same. Whether you're female or not is irrelevant, that's more like a private detail. And Detrius the troll, along with another new character called Inigo Skimmer, who is a very strange sort of diplomatic figure. He's there to do the actual proper diplomatic talk and do the paperwork and such. And this combination of characters, whom are mostly majorities in Uberworld, dwarfs and trolls are obviously major in the world. They go there to get some trade deals started and to be diplomatic and such, and things don't go exactly according to plan, frankly. Nobody really likes him being there because to them he's this, interfering guy from a city that they don't particularly like. They just want to be left alone to do their thing, and they just think, well, you can go back to your city and mind your own business, frankly. This creates tension and it creates a whole lot of troubles for everybody involved, especially Vimes. But at one point, and this is not a spoiler because it's on the back of not this edition but one of the editions, he ends up in a forest wearing merely the gloomy trousers of Uncle Vanya, and who's been lent to him by three women who are just living in some strange house out in the woods. Now that sounds like a really strange detail, and it is, but it works for a particular reason. Anyway, and frankly, it's a case of the set characters, which is led by Vimes, going to Otherworld and seeing what happens, along with at the same time Sergeant Angua, who is a werewolf. Basically she leaves the city at the start of the book, goes back to Otherworld for some unknown reason, just runs away apparently, seemingly, and Carrot, who is her boyfriend essentially, they never like using those terms together but they are a couple, he basically follows her into Otherworld and events unfold from there, and it's interesting, quite complex actually, and really funny overall. And one of the reasons why the book is so funny and amusing is because of the characters. Now in this, the range of characters is still as wide as normal because the focus where you have the whole city watch is still there, but this time it's on a group that's away from the city, which is interesting by itself, and the various city watch characters who are staying behind in Mortal Book to manage the city watch and manage the crime levels. That by itself is an interesting combination. So you've got, going on the diplomatic talk, Vimes and his wife Sybil, who is a very interesting couple and combination of characters. You've got obviously Carrot and Angua, who is separate from them, who are been going separately, and they've got a very interesting and very different dynamic in this book compared to the previous books as well. I don't want to say too much more about them because there's a reason why I want to say it, but they've got a very curious dynamic in this book, more so than the previous ones. And then you've got Sherry the dwarf, or Cheery the dwarf, as he will say on occasion, and Detrius the troll, who everybody thinks of as the big thick troll because their brains don't work at high temperatures well. Basically they need really low temperatures for them to think, and with Detrius he needs very low temperatures for his brain to function properly. Don't blame him actually, I don't like the heat either. And they are interesting characters who come into their own in this because they are going in, they're sort of the old country, where their ancestry is originally from, and it's an interesting journey of going back to where you're from, at least where you think you're from. Ultimately, are you from that location, the old country, or are you from where you live, where you are? And personally, I'm more believe the second. So it's an interesting question and something that's brought up well, and the characters are always really well written, fun, enjoyable, and they're all developed well, and they've got more development than ever in this one, and they develop in ways in this because of the fact that obviously the split between the city and obviously the country of Otherworld in an interesting way. They've developed differently and in a curious way, which I think is really impressive. And one of the reasons why they develop differently is because of their locations. The city of Ankh-Morpork is again really well developed. It does get a little bit more development, but frankly at this point it's already developed enough, and you know everything about Ankh-Morpork if you've read the books in order, which obviously I have, and I would personally recommend people to do. And it's a city that works, lives and breathes and has fallings out as cities tend to do. And then you've got Otherworld, which is this massive, vast, frankly it's Russia and Eastern European countries all together, and the blurred boundaries between the countries, big forests, dark and dank and gloomy, and you got little villages dotted all over the place with curious little villages dotted on, outcroppings of rocks and mountains and things, and it's just a massive vast country, very different from Outlook, and it contrasts and complements Ankh really well, which I think works brilliantly as well. As far as the ideas and themes in the book are concerned, one of them is obviously talking about the idea of diplomacy in regards to cities and nations and nationalities and species, obviously in this case, but that's relatively minor. One of the major points though is frankly what makes you you. Are you based upon where you were born, where you were brought up, or is something more to you? Are you based upon your ancestry, your bloodlines? In bloodlines, specifically that word does play an important role in the books. I mean, think about it. The otherworld families, the werewolves and the vampires, they are very old and frankly, for the most part, quite arrogant bloodlines and families, and they like the power and the control they've got in Overworld, and this doesn't mix well with Purple, and it's an interesting combination which works really well. And the other major sort of theme and idea is questioning assumptions. Don't always assume things about a particular nationality or group of people, because often assumptions are just that. They're based on stereotypes, cliches, and they don't work most of the time. I mean, you think they do, but everybody knows ultimately it doesn't work very well when you base things upon assumptions, and when what you think you know is different from what you actually know. And it's an interesting combination and an interesting subject which the book deals with in a really quite touching and also very silly way, which to great results overall. So with that said, that is it for my review of The Fifth Elephant by Terry Pratchett. Overall a brilliant fantasy novel. I wouldn't recommend this to be your first Discworld novel because it's too far into the series by this point, especially with all the history and of the characters and such. It might not make frankly much sense. It could well spoil earlier things. I mean, it's not a direct sequel in a practical sense, but it does carry on character development and such, which I think would be spoiled if you didn't read it in at least a rough order. Anyway, so if you've read this book or you'd like to, then please leave a comment and we can have a talk about it. Or if you want to talk about anything else related to Discworld novels, then feel free to leave a comment as well. We can talk about that. All my social media links as well as a link to this book can be found in the description box below as always. And with that said, that is it for this video. So thank you for watching and I'll see you another day. Bye for now.